All right, we are COMP125 in the summer 2018 semester. We're week 6, part 2 of our broadcast. We started talking about form validation very briefly yesterday, mostly what we dealt with. Babel, we talked about more ECMAScript 6. And truly, guys, just before we get into more stuff about forms and stuff, because this is like enhancing forms and everything, I want you to think about this, all right? So you have new language features and you have older language features. And we talked about yesterday one tool that we can use to transpile. That's the word. It's not, we're not teleporting, but it's like teleportation in some ways in terms of we're translating our code from one set of parameters into another. Our grammar changes, so it's more like transliteration or translation, if you will, and that's why they call it transpiling, because you're compiling into the new language, but really you're just translating. So translating, kind of, and compiling, transpiling, right? And so we talked about Babel, how to get that through NPM. If you're using Visual Studio itself, Visual Studio also has, you can get Babel through NuGet, the NuGet package manager, and install it that way as well. In fact, you can do a lot of that stuff with Visual Studio, the big Visual Studio 2017. Last week, I think they announced 2019, finally. Visual Studio 2019 coming out with more features and all that kind of stuff. I'm not sure what the due date for that one is, but soon. So that's the kind of stuff that, that we were talking about yesterday a little bit. We also talked about some, at a very high level, Gulp and, yesterday almost like a building tool, a way of transpiling easier. Because, imagine if you have to do it by hand every single time, going to the console and go Babel, -d source, and then the destination, whatever it is. And then what you're doing with that is you're basically doing it every single time by hand. If you forget to do it, then maybe something's not going to work properly, or you won't have the proper code. So we talked about that yesterday, and that was kind of like, I have to include some of this ECMAScript 6 stuff for you because that's modern JS, right? It's not the old stuff. The old stuff in ECMAScript 5 is okay. You can get by 90% of the time. We saw yesterday, or 99% of the time with ECMAScript 5 so far. But you'll miss out on some really important features of the language, as well as shortcuts, things that make the language better and more modern from a developer standpoint, which is what I'm trying to inject into the course, which makes the course a little bit more challenging for you. I'm just being honest. That's how it works. And the course is going to change. I've been talking to other professors as well. We're not going to keep it as simple as it is right now. They're probably going to go with most of my recommendations, but only because it has to change, right? It's not enough from what you're getting. We're not just doing DOM manipulation nowadays, right? We're using front-end frameworks, and I talked about 2 of them yesterday. What 2 frameworks did I talk about yesterday that are actually, one was a JavaScript library, and the other one was a framework. What are the 2 that I mentioned from yesterday? Do you remember? You weren't here? What do you guys? You guys remember the two? There's a JavaScript library and a framework. I meant what? Angular is a JavaScript framework, and React. Those are the 2 most popular front ends that people are using these days in their code. They can use it with any backend. They can use it with ASP.NET. You can learn ASP.NET next semester with in COMP229. They can use it with Express and Node, right? They can use it with a bunch of backends, and it doesn't matter. So you have this idea of separation of concerns, and where you should be learning something about that soon. The idea that there's going to be a view, this idea of model view controller. Have you guys heard model view controller? You heard about it? Have you studied about it, or have you just heard about it?
Model is actually your classes which contain data or something from the database, and the view is your screens, media, and the controller is the logic.
Okay, so the answer that came from Riaz was models were something that connects to your data. Yes, it's classes that connect to your data. That's what they do, and they pass data from your database into your application, whatever that is. That's the model. And then there's the view, which is your front end screen, the stuff you see. He says screens, It doesn't have to be screens. It could be anything that produces some kind of user interface. That's what it is. So it ties into the model. And then you have the controller that talks between the model and the view, right? And the controller is just another set of classes or functions or whatever is code that really controls what you see in the view, right? Yeah. No. Model view controller is just a pattern, right? So it's not more secure. It can be just as insecure as anything else, right? It's just it's a design pattern, right? So I can use model view controller pattern for video games, right? The view, what the user interface is for the player, controllers, what controls the view, and the model that connects the database and the servers, allows the player to play together with other people, the network. That's all the models, right? So it's just a design pattern. So when you look at design patterns, there are, again, a lot of design patterns out there. And there's some really popular ones for JavaScript. And one of them is this model view controller pattern for web development. But Apple uses it for iOS. And a lot of other companies use it for their code. So MVC is what we want to get to, right? In order for us to get to MVC with JavaScript, it's kind of a challenge, right? Because right now we have multiple pages. Each page is controlled by the JavaScript pages on the back end, right? And there's a lot of duplication. Remember we talked about last week, there was a principle, the dry principle, which is do not repeat yourself. That's the dry principle, right? Or don't repeat yourself. Don't repeat yourself is very important. Keep your code dry. But we're repeating ourselves over and over again. Like we said, so far, index.html, about.html, contact.html, lots of repetition, right? And I don't want that. Eventually, I want to move away from that. So we need to get into Ajax, which I'm going to do in the second half of semester, right? In order for us to move away from that, where we kind of inject templating code from one file into another one, right? And that's the way we're going to do it. Yesterday, we also talked about JavaScript templating, which is the new way of putting strings together for output, right? We talked about the regular way, which is concatenation. So you have a string and then plus another string. That's the old way. And the new way is backtick, $, curly brace, and inside the curly brace you have some kind of variable, and it injects the variable or interpolates that variable from your code into the string, and it outputs the resulting string, which is the variable inside of the string, variable data, the value of the variable in the string. That's new, fairly new with ECMAScript 6. So a lot of stuff we talked about yesterday, but we didn't get a lot of validation done. We did talk about how to print stuff out with on the console for the form, which is part of your assignment number 2, right? So I'm trying to give you the solutions for that kind of stuff too, to give you an idea of how to do it. Your assignment number 2 obviously might be a little bit different. I'm just going to bring up the code from yesterday. I've also put up this code on GitHub in a regular place. However, just to note, took a while to put it up. And right now, the other thing to note is that the dist folder right now is unused in our code. We're not using it. I'm just showing it to you to show you what how it transpiles from here to here, what the difference is. But we're not using this right now. We're just having it there just to kind of talk about it a little bit as a talking point more than anything else. So we're really using this. We also talked about how to set up Babel. Babel setup is not easy, right? I mean, if you've never done Node before and now you're using NPM, I actually included a couple things here, and one of them was this Babel RC file with this presets. And what this allows us to do is kind of translate Babel in the browser and so on. My version of Babel REPL, which is what I had in here, wasn't working. I'm not sure if you guys had more luck. But if you look at my extension, which I talked about, which is Babel REPL, here it is right here, right? This, unfortunately, wasn't working for me. And all you'd have to do, if you look at the example, is you just write, you have 2 parts. It provides an input and an output. And what you do, just exactly what we did online, it actually produces the output on the other side, right? So kind of a neat inclusion into Visual Studio Code. Mine didn't work for whatever reason. And it doesn't matter, even if it doesn't work, you can always use the online resource that I shared with you yesterday, which was not this one, which was this one, which was the Babel REPL And notice this is Babel 6.x, right? There's different versions of Babel where you translate from this side to this side, and it kind of, you can try it out. Some people, what they do is if they have small projects, not a lot of code, they write their new code here and they copy paste. Just take this part here, copy it, put it into their code, right? It works. No transpiling necessary, right? Because it's perfectly fine. Challenge with that is maintainability. Because, you know, I mean, some stuff in here, especially this like convenience function up here, this class call check, convenience function they included may not work the same as what you expect. So it's easier, obviously, to maintain this side than this side. And that's why you want to try and use this transpiling stuff. So we talked about that yesterday. Any questions around that? Like why ECMAScript 6, why Babel? You know, does everyone use it? If you take any more advanced courses, and I just want to point out some stuff. So let's just look at some future stuff before we move on, right? Because I know you guys are going to do this. So if I look at something like, you know, Centennial College, and let's look at, just by chance, we'll look at a program here. I'm not trying to pump Centennial College in my video here or anything, but let's look at programs, right? So if you look at C programs for a second, and if you look at, you know, full-time programs as an example, and let's look at one day when this thing comes up. Let's say we want to look at, these are all the full-time programs. So I want to scroll down until we get to our software engineering programs, which are way down here, right? And I just want to point this out because, you know, and I'm just going to pick one of them. Co-op, fast track. I want to get the, you know, the 3-year or whatever. So this is post-secondary, this is 3 years. Again, I'm just picking one. It doesn't really matter. Here's the optional co-op one. But they're very similar. If you look at our program online, and if you look at the, here's the program outline, you can see the courses that we have mostly in first semester. Let's see if I can get into the other semester. So then when you get into semester 5 and 6, you have some optional courses that come up, right? Notice that there's, you know, 329 and a bunch of other ones. And then here's semester 6. So there's one, COMP125, that I talked about before, right? So this is into semester 6. So if you're you know, if you're going to take a course that's 3 years, you're going to probably hit a, you know, an option. There's an optional course, COMP125, which is emerging technologies. This course we're doing today and the way we're doing it is going to lead you directly into that course. If you don't know that this course, this COMP125 course will be very challenging, like extremely challenging, because it's all JavaScript. So you're like, okay, but Tom, you're talking about something that's 4 semesters away. Yep, I am. But you need to know about it. So that's one. There's also some electives, and notice that there's a bunch of electives here. Here's one, COMP392, which is a, it's an elective that, you know, people take a lot of times. It's advanced graphics with JavaScript again, right? So definitely going to help you there with this JavaScript here, right? And it doesn't show it here, but in semester 5, you might have some options as well for COMP397. I'm not sure if it's here or in semester 4. Here it is. From semester 4 on, you have an elective that's COMP397. Here's one. That's also another one that we do, web game programming, purely with JavaScript. And I teach that one as well, right? So, I mean, it's not that far away, you know, that you're going to need it more and more. And remember, it's the language of the web, the true language of the web, right? It's not PHP, it's not Python, it's not Java, it's JavaScript. That's the real language of the web, all right? So yes, those other languages exist. They help, they create servers and backends and really cool effects as well that you can do, especially from a security perspective. Some of those other languages and frameworks are really, really good and useful. Not gonna put them down in any way. But, you know, at the same time, you know, you need to know your JavaScript. JavaScript is like, there's like, you know, the triple threat, right? HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's how it goes, right? Forget the phone call. I don't know why they're calling me in the middle of my class.
We don't do anything for health informatics track.
Sorry?
For health informatics track,
yeah,
we don't have any JavaScript.
I don't know that. But there might be, again, even for health and informatics, if you look at some of the technical electives, you may have something different. And I'm not going to look at them right now. All right, so so that's why I'm pointing out how important it is. Okay, so we did a couple things last day. We did autocomplete. We talked about this. Let's just run this program one more time. So I'm back in here, and I'm going to run this thing. So I'm going to go light server, light-server, and let's see how it comes up. Light server, by the way, can be configured as well. If you go to light server, npm, the npm file for light server, you can configure a different port for light server. You can have a lot of other configurations that you can use for light server as well. So it's not just the one thing. So here we are with our form. We have a very simple form. And if I click send right now, it doesn't do anything. Why? Because if you remember what we did with it, it doesn't even validate. So if I just did this and send, no validation. I didn't turn validation off, right? If I go back to here, if you notice, back down here, it says autocomplete is true, but I didn't turn validation off. The only thing I turned off, right, was this stuff, prevent default. When I did this prevent default stuff, that also prevented everything else. This default behavior is the stuff that triggers the validation to turn on, right? So there's HTML5 validation, but right now it's been disabled because we're doing this. We've changed everything so it stops this from happening, this prevent default stuff. So we can output the form to the console. That's what we're doing, okay? And I've done this on purpose because I want you guys to do manual validation, right? How do I make validation look good? As an example, with everything else that's going on, right? So that's the first thing. So the first thing is, hey, why isn't it working? Right, it's not working because of this, prevent default. Okay, so if you have a question around that. The other thing is we talked about yesterday, we talked about this %C a little bit more. Last week I kind of introduced it, and this is again I'm using backticks. So this is the templating type as opposed to the double quotes. And when I use backtick and %C, what it does is it injects some kind of CSS into your console, right? So if I go to the console window, if I go to inspect, again, this is a little bit of review from yesterday. You can see that I've got some stuff in here that, if I keep on sending, it'll just keep sending forever because guess what? That's what we've made it do, right? And we've made it blue just because we made it blue. You can make it whatever color you like. And notice that it picked up this one, but these ones are empty because that's what we've done. If I enter some stuff in there, you can see now that it's not empty anymore, right? You can see that it's not empty on the third one, and typing random stuff, it's not empty there either. And then 4 and 5 are the buttons, send and cancel, because what I'm doing is I'm looping over the entire form. Remember that the form itself has a length in terms of elements, how many elements we have, and I'm looping through each of the elements here with a for loop. And what I'm doing is I'm injecting the index of the for loop into the form, this console log, and document.forms.elements index. I want to get the value of that index, and I'm injecting that out. That's what's happening. So I'm getting the value. That's how we output the value of the form, and that's how we check the value. We need to compare the value with what we want. Okay? Again, just review from yesterday. So going back to the PowerPoint, because I'm using this as a guide for today. Again, we have submit, check validity, right? It says, again, initiates browser-based validation of form controls, returning true if all controls are valid. Okay? Now we did, and again, if you notice, it's the form objects, check validity, right? So form objects. So again, notice two things. Our validity is off, right? Because I've stopped default behavior, right? I want to add that back in. So you would be forgiven to think that I can go back into here, into my contact form, and when I'm clicking the button, let me just get rid of this part right here so you can see a little bit better. When I'm clicking the button, then I want to make my form check validity. I want to do that after I, kind of output form data to console. I want to somehow check the validity when I press the submit button. Okay, so how do I do that? So I can do something like, let's say, I want to access the form, so I could do document, right? .forms, and then the first form, which is forms 1, and then if I say check validity, right? And it says it's a Boolean, okay? It returns whether a form will validate when it is submitted without having to submit it, okay? So that's what it does. So if I do this and I press this, this provides a true false, about a Boolean value, right? So I can kind of output this. I can kind of do console log, right? I'm kind of writing it backwards for you guys. And what I want to do is I want to use the backtick, and I can do one of these, right? I can actually put in this whole thing in here, right? Inside the backtick, right? And then that will be my, oops, if I can close it off. That would be the way this whole thing is going to be output to the, to the console. I can do this. And then I can add some additional stuff. So form validates, and then it'll print out, it'll kind of inject if it's true or false. I should get a true or false here. All right. So what would you be expecting? Would you expect it to validate right now or not? So think about this for a second while we check it out. So going back to my thing here, okay, I'm going to click send, and it says form validates false. Why does it validate false? Because on the form itself, which is inside here, here's my contact, I have injected some things in here that we need, right? For example, I said that my full name is required, right? The required tag or attribute is it's part of the ECMAScript 6, HTML5. I'll be my mind is ECMAScript. HTML5 standard, right? ECMAScript 5, and I can't even say it today. ECMAScript 5 and HTML5, they included required and a bunch of other attributes and forms to make them better, right? So required basically indicates to my JavaScript that something's wrong. I'm missing this. I'm missing those 4 or 5 fields, whatever I've made required. If I remove these, just to show you, so if I take these out, so I'm going to just cut them out for now. So let's just cut them all out of this is out of my HTML form, just so you can see the difference. And I'm going to save this one now. So I'm saving it. See, it's already reloaded my form, and I go back to my stuff here and I click send. It says true, right? So it validates now because I don't have those as required fields. It means I can send my form with nothing. Okay. Okay, cool. So we can detect when the form is not validated. I'm just going to do those things. So I want those changes back. I want those required fields back, right? We can detect when it's validating. And that's one thing that HTML5 helps us do. It helps us kind of with validation, detect whether the fields that we've decided to be required are required. Okay, so that's one thing. Going back to the PowerPoint. So that's what the validity. Now submit. It says submits the form without the use of a submit button. So I can, if I don't need to submit, I've hijacked the submit button functionality right now, right? Because what I've done with the submit functionality, right, is I've said prevent default. That's what I've done. So I said, hey, don't submit yet. I want to be able to do something with it before you submit, right? Which is putting out stuff to the console, right? But you can actually submit the form itself by using the submit method, right? So if I go back to this, and let's go back to the contact.js. So here I'm using my output form data to console, which is this function that just does a bunch of output for us. That's all it does. It's not really doing any validation at all. I could submit the form afterwards. Now, you'll never see the output because by the time you see the output to the console, it's submitting the form, which will clear the form out, right? So again, it'll be document.forms 0, right? And then I'm not getting any code hinting. Submit, right? That's what we're actually asking it to do. And if it's not for whatever reason. And sometimes this happens, by the way, with notice how it says loading. That's my hinting, my code hinting loading, right? It happens sometimes with Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is an editor, right? It's not an IDE. And so sometimes what happens is you need to close this stuff down. Yeah, it's, I gotta load this up again. So here's my, and if I see loading like this, it means I'm not getting code hinting. But I know this is correct. So let's just go back. So I'm going to my code here. And if I click send, right, it's submitted. And now it's cleared again. So if I put some data in there, you'll see a brief info in here. And then bam, it's gone. right? That's not cool, right? It submitted my stuff, it outputted my things to console, and then it's gone, right? We need to be able to save that information. And of course, we would never do it like this. In JavaScript, we would never output the console. The assignment 2 is really a very protracted example of, hey, can you print your form data to the console? That's all I've asked you to do, really, at the end of the day, if you think about it, right? But that's not really what we would normally do. What we normally do is take that form data and send it somewhere into a PHP file, or if you're using PHP as a backend, or process it with Node.js, or process it somewhere else, or save that form data into a file using Ajax. Whatever you're doing, you need to be able to save this stuff. That's really hard, by the way. You have to be able to save this stuff so that it kind of is able to do something with the form data. The form data right now would be lost, right? So again, this submit, that's the regular behavior, right? So one is we've prevented regular behavior, just to say that again. I'm repeating this for a long time because this is going to be on your test, right? So I'm preventing default behavior. And by the way, you can prevent default behavior for any event. I'm clicking a button, right? When I press a button on the keyboard, I can have a keyboard event, right? Register. When I'm moving my mouse over the button, there's a hover event for the mouse button, right? It registers the event. I can prevent the default behavior for the event, so the whole hover effect that I want or whatever, by using this event.prevent default, right? But it puts all the onus on us to program everything back in, right? That's the thing. So let's just undo that right now because we don't want to submit the form yet, okay? All right, so this is important stuff. That's why I brought this page up, and I'm looking at this because it's important to know what all this stuff does. So going through this, there's different elements it talks about here, and input fields can also have these extra things, right? So, okay, validity. So returns the value true if the control value passes browser-based validation rules. Okay, so what does that mean? So the value is, again, we've talked about the control value. Will validate returns the value true if constraint validation is enabled for the control. We can talk about this. Here's the validation message, sets or returns the text of the message to be displayed to the user after a failed submit event if the field's validity value is false. Okay, so if the field's validity value is false. So if my validity is false, I can make a validation message for each of the fields, in each of the input fields. Okay, this is important to know. So that means that if I have an input, I can say whatever that input is, dot validation message is equal to, and then whatever that validation message I want. You must enter X number of characters. You must have this pattern, for postal code, well, as an example, or phone number. That's what the validation message gives us. All right, so check validity, we talked about that, and set custom validity with a message, we can do that too. So again, this is, notice it goes within methods of elements within forms. So this isn't for the form itself, but each of the inputs that's inside the form, okay? So again, constraint validation against the form element returns true, we already talked about this, or false, and this one sets a custom message, a string message for the text to be displayed. Okay, how do we see this stuff, this sets custom validity message, right? Okay, well, going back to here, if we were to take this off for now, this part, if I took this off, right, so on click, I'm going to submit the field. It's going to do everything. It's going to validate too now because I've taken this prevent default off, right? I've taken my control off. Controls are all off now, right? So if I go back and if I save, and if I go back to the form and click send, oh, now I'm getting validity again. However, I'm also getting this, my form output, right? Because it hasn't moved, right? Even if every time I check this, it's gonna say my form validation is false. Here's my form data. This is good. This is what I want, right? So now it tells me some messages. It says, if I go here, it says, please fill out this field. Okay, right? Then it's gonna say, please fill out this field. These aren't very useful messages, right? We want more custom messages to come up here that say, the name field is required, something like that, right? So let's inject that information. So we're going to go back to our code. And so far our validation is turned on. We're going to go back to our, so this outputs, you know, the console, right? And this is only, we only want to output to the console if and only if the validity fails, right? So this check validity stuff that we did before, so where I said, hey, print out if the form is valid or not, which is this, check validity, right? We know it's not, right? So I'm going to make it check. I'm going to say if, and instead of retyping this, I'm just going to drag this whole thing in here, cut it. Don't care about printing out if it's true or false. The only way it's going to work now is if this field, we don't need this part because this is not going to be a template anymore, right? We're going to say, hey, so if this is true, if check validity is true, then that's cool, right? Then do something else. Go on, submit, right? Otherwise, if it's false, output the data to the console and do a bunch of other stuff, right? So what I want to do is I want to say, well, I don't want to check when it's true. If it's true, submit. Submit the form, man, right? It's only when it's not true. So I'm going to put this little bang in front of it, or this not, exclamation mark again before this Boolean value means if it's not true, then let's do a couple things here. What do I want to do? I'm going to make a new scope. So this is a new code block. I'm going to take this thing in here. This is the first thing I'm going to do when I kind of put this in here. Okay, only if it's not true is it going to output to the console, because it's not going to matter anyway, right? If it's not true, it's going to stop here, right? That's the first thing. And now I want to do something else. So outputting to the console is one. That's outputting my form data, but it's not doing any validation. Now I want to validate. I want to send some validation messages or whatever, right? So I want to kind of do this validate form thing, right? So I want to kind of make a new function, which I don't have yet, called validate form. I'm going to put that over here. And again, I'm working within the contact.js file, right? So it's inside of this closure. So function, right? Validate form. In my validate form, the first thing I want to do is check to see check my validation messages. I want to make sure all my validation messages are different. So let's do that. So let's get access to each of the form values. Now we've already done this here, right? And I don't want to do it again. So this is a great example where I want to put this inside of the namespace of my content. By the way, we also talked about arrow functions. This is equivalent to function content without the arrow. If I was to change it back, it would look like this. To remind you what the difference is, that's the only difference right now. That's equivalent, right? I'll leave it this old way for now. But what I want to do is I want to take these things, these fields, which I'm going to reuse. I'm going to reuse these things. So I'm getting references to the fields, and then each of the fields I want to make a custom message for, right? So I want to kind of cut these out here. And inside of my form data, I'm going to go up here. I'm going to say some kind of comments that says, you know, so local variables, right? I have in here. And let me just make this pretty. So I'm just going to do a format document. So all that's nice and pretty now, right? Okay, so output from data to console, that does one thing. It doesn't do much. And you're not going to get any. This is a private member function right now because it's inside of this closure, and I'm not sharing it down here. Remember, we talked about that. This is all the public stuff. These are all the public functions, as an example, exposed to the content namespace, which we created. All right, anything that I mentioned down here, right? But these ones, right? This one I didn't mention, and I didn't mention this one, validate form. That's internal. The rest of my application doesn't know how to validate the form because the rest of my application doesn't have a contact form. It's just this, right? As an example. So my validate form is going to use those fields. So that's one thing. So these are all references to the fields themselves inside the form, whatever that form is. Now I could have referenced them by element. I could have said form 0 element 1 or element 0, form 0 element 1, form 0 element 2, form 0 element 3. And remember that when we talked about this yesterday, the elements collection is part of all forms that exist. That's something we talked about yesterday. Okay, again, I'm just repeating myself just from a kind of review perspective. Okay, So that's cool. We've got these local variables. We're going to reuse these again and again. And notice this still works because we're using full name and then dot value. And that's why I said, hey, let's not put the values here because that's not the only thing I need my elements for. I need them to validate too, right? So in here, now that I have full name and so on, I can say, well, full name dot. And then I want to make a message, right? So going back to our PowerPoint, you can see that inside of here, you have this validation message, right? Sets or returns the validation message. So if I say full name dot set, and again, see, it doesn't know that, unfortunately, that my full name is of type, what type it is. It just knows it's an HTML element, but it doesn't know what my form is. My full name is actually a form element, and each form element has these extra attributes, these extra things that I can do, right? So I could do this, validation message thing in here. So if I say instead of set, I can say validation message, right? And it doesn't know what it is. And let's just say is equal to you must enter an appropriate full name. I don't know, with at least, make it as big as 2 characters, because maybe some names only have 2 characters. I don't know. Like someone just give me the first name and their name is Al. All right, AL. That's kind of valid, right? And they don't want to give me their last name. Okay, if I was in a form, maybe that would be minimum that I would need. Okay, so this validation message. Okay, so what does this do? Does it do anything, right? So if I go back to my form and I just type send, says, please fill out this field. It doesn't do a darn thing, right? It doesn't change this in any way, right? And this happened because of 2 reasons. One, the order that I'm validating, right? So yes, everything is good. The form has loaded, right? And as the form loads, the page loads, the form loads, it's almost like I got to make this field happen, this change in the field happen earlier, right? Because it's only coming out when I press the send button. But the send button is going to trigger the response before I reset it to my custom message, this custom message here, this validate form, right? So maybe what I want to do is set custom messages instead of right now validate form. Let's make another function that kind of sets custom messages. So set custom validation messages. I'm just making this up. And let's just try this out. I want to kind of get this one, cut it out here, and go here, right? And I want to load this regardless of whether or not I'm checking. So when the form loads, and this happens on content, when this happens up here, right? I don't need autocomplete on because it's not going to work. I'm going to put this in there. I'm going to say something like, oops, I'm going to say set custom messages, right? So form loads, and when the form loads, I'm going to set the custom messages before my button is clicked, right? So this full name is happening before I click my button. When the form loads, this content is going to trigger, right? My whole page loads. And then before my cancel button is even in place or anything like that, I'm setting my custom validation messages. This is probably the right place to put it, but we don't know if that custom validation message is correct yet. So if I click send, it says please fill out the fields. This is no good. This is no good, right? So if I look at, if I go to form elements, validation message in here, again, you would search in here and you would go to either Mozilla. I want to see if there's, yeah, here it is. This is W3 Schools, and it gives you this actual thing, kind of a little tutorial in here that does that. So I'm getting the element like I did right here. So here's my get element by ID. This is the check validity. Does it check or not? That's for the form itself, right? Because the form is, here's my input. I can check for each of the inputs if it's valid or not. And then here's my inner HTML. That's what it says. So my form itself, here's my document.getElementID demo, right? Okay, so here's a paragraph tag with my validation message, which is input object.validation message. Just gets the validation message, and it injects it into this paragraph. That's what it does. Okay? So it says contains the message a browser will display when the validation is false, right? That's what this does. So here's my custom error, set to true if the custom validity message is set, right? And that's interesting. It says sets and gets and sets, but actually what's happening is it's just getting. It's not setting in this particular case. Why I'm referencing this is because the book is really focusing on ECMAScript 3.1, the book that you have, and with some inference with ECMAScript 5, and some of the best resources are online, like W3 Schools, right? So it talks about things like pattern mismatch, range underflow, step mismatch, all this other stuff that you can do with validity properties to make sure that it's it's true or not. But this validation message is just getting it. Will validate indicates if an input element it will be validated, if it's going to be validated or not, right? But the one we want to use is this custom validation message, right? So again, notice it's not there. So if I do that, if I say, form custom validation message, I'll tell you right now that you'll run into the same issue when you try it on your own, right? So when I was putting together your lab, I was like, hey, let's get them to do a custom validation message. And I was like, oh yeah, but there's some challenges with that. So I'm showing you, right? So again, here's this set custom validity, which we talked about before, right? Set custom validity. And an example on Stack Overflow in our particular case where the target, so again, okay, so here, let's read this JavaScript code. And by the way, you have to be good at reading JavaScript code like this, right? Online. You're gonna look at it and go, wait a minute, what the heck is happening here? When I look at Stack Overflow, how do I interpret this message? If you're not a JavaScript developer, it's gonna have trouble. So one is when the DOM content loaded, that is the event that we're triggering, okay? Here's my function. We're saying all the elements, so document.getElements by tag name inputs, right? Someone's having a good time on there. And then for the length of the number of elements we get, right? So when elements are not valid, right, what we're going to say is that the target of the the element that's not valid, we're going to wipe out. So set custom validity wipes out the message, right? And then when it's message, once it's wiped out, it says if not the target validity is valid, if not valid, right? That's what it says here. Then set the custom validity to this field cannot be left blank. So set custom validity is the right way to do it. And again, this is just one example from Stack Overflow. You can find others. So going back, we didn't do it wrong necessarily. It just, well, the idea is right. The execution is wrong. So this validation message is wrong. And we're not getting any code ending because we don't know that our element is a form element, right? So again, I'm just going to comment that out. And I'm doing it on load. This is not when the form loads. This is with page loads. When the page loads, I'm setting the custom validity of the elements. So after the pages load, the elements exist, right? Otherwise, if I did it ahead of time, the elements wouldn't exist. So I'll say full name set custom validation, custom validity, right? Like it says here, set custom validity. Unfortunately, I'm not getting any kind of validity. I'm going to spell it wrong for sure. And so will you. And then, okay, there's the error string. So this is good. Actually, I got some good feedback finally. Okay, didn't know what my form was, but it knows set custom validity. It says, here's my error string. So this, I'm more confident now that it's going to happen. So let's just get this thing here, and not including the semicolon. Come on. And then we'll just jump into there. Right, there it is, with the semicolon, for the full name only. All right, let's see if that works. So going back to our code, right? Again, if I click send, that's what I'm expecting to see, and yeah, right? Makes sense? That's the first thing we want to try and do. So we want to, if I click send again, you can see that it's going to show the validity message for my code, right? I want my own custom validity to come up because, did you see what I did? You're looking confused. So, okay, step one. I needed to set up a function to do this, right? Because I don't want to do all this stuff randomly somewhere else. And I'm doing it as soon as my page loads. So my contact content loads, then I modified the custom messages that my form elements are going to display, right? Otherwise, it's going to display this form field must be, you know, kind of thing. That's the first thing, first step. Let's do it for the other ones. So full name, we have contact number, right? And set custom validity. She doesn't come up, but we can say, you know, my display string, you must enter a phone number with the pattern like number dash number. We don't have that pattern yet. We're not checking for that, but that's what we're going to give the output. That's what we want the pattern to be, right? Can't just enter random numbers as a phone number, right? All right, cool. So that's my contact number. And then we also have my email address. Your email address is not valid because there's a lot of patterns for email. We can't just say it needs to have this because email address could have .com, .co, you know, best, BEST, whatever. Like there's a lot coming to create custom validation rules for that. We'll just say your email address is not valid, right? And then my final thing is my message. So message set custom validity, and we're going to say something like, here it is. We're going to say you must enter a message. So if you miss one of those things, I mean, again, you can make your own messages up. I'm just typing random stuff. So obviously we don't need this anymore. It's something that makes sense for your form. And by the way, we're making a contact form. There might be a totally different use case scenario for a login form, right? Your username is incorrect, right? Or not long enough, or whatever, or not recognized. And you can change the custom validity of these things on the fly too, right? Where they put it in and you check the database, it comes back, says your email address is not recognized. So that's what these do. This is for HTML5 validity. All right, that's what this does. It doesn't do anything actually. This doesn't validate anything. It just tells the user something's missing. So going back here, if I click on send, you can see now it says you must enter an appropriate full name with at least 2 characters. Okay, so 2 characters. Uh-oh. Wait a minute. And if I go to the next line, right? You know, we'll take a look here. Like I went to the next line, and if I click send, it goes back to here. Uh-oh. Why? Because my message is correct, right? But it's always going to set this message. And that's why, going back to the Stack Overflow that we saw earlier, that's why it did this. Where we have you know, document element by ID and so on, and we're saying, hey, for each element, set the default validity to nothing. So there's no validity because we're making our own valid. And if the target is not valid, then set this message. All right. So going back to that, if we're going to set the custom validity messages here, when the form loads, that means regardless whether they're valid or invalid, it's going to show that message. That's what it does. So that's another problem. So this is just an example of one way of doing it. Let's figure another way of doing it in our code, right? So we want to do this, set custom validity for messages, right? And right now, the form is invalid, right? And it's never been set up. So what we want to do is almost like another function. I'm breaking this down into functions only for clarity, guys. I could do it in one, right? But we maybe instead of set custom validity messages, we want to do clear validation messages, right? So function, we'll say clear validation messages. right? That's the first thing we want to do. When I get all this, again, copy paste, and go in here. And instead of having all this, we're just going to clear it out. I'm going to kind of do one of these, right? And want to clear the validation messages first, right? So there's no validation message if it's not invalid, right? All right, cool. So great. So that does this. And then we're going to set the custom validation messages to whatever they are, right? Okay. But again, this is happening for all at once. And we may have to go through here and check validity of each one and set the custom validation message for each one as we go. All right, so instead of set custom validation messages now, let's not do that. Let's clear. So we'll say clear. I know, a lot of work, eh? Clear validation messages because we're taking control of this thing. So we're not actually calling this function yet at all. And if I go back here, and if I go to my form, and if I click send, it's going to say please fill out this field again, right? But only when it's not filled out. So if I click on a thing and I go here and I click send, it's going to come to this one, back to where we were before. This is good, right? Because that's what this does. This clears the validation messages back to the default, right? Right. But going down here, we know that up here, if my form check validity fails, right, I'd like to be able to, so before validating the form, I want to do this form validation stuff. So I can say set custom validation messages, right? But that means for all of them. One fails, everything has failed. That means now they're not going to work anymore, right? So what do I mean by this? So if I go back and try to do it this way, so again, I'm just putting it this, so I'm saying, hey, it fails validity. Now set the messages. Also bad. And why? Because if I go here and go to this, and I click send, and say, you must enter the appropriate characters. It tells me right back here for the entire form, right? Because the form fails validation. So the first thing is, okay, the form failed validation. The second thing is, which element failed validation? Which one of the elements failed validation right now? That's the second thing we got to check. So it's not enough to do what we did, right? So we're going to do another check, and we're going to do this loop that's inside of here that basically says, okay, cool, which one failed validation? So output form data to console is cool. Set custom validation messages is going to happen, not yet. But we want to do this validate form stuff, okay, which is this function that we've kind of put in place here. I've made the other ones up here as a placeholder. We're going to use these in a second. We might break this out a little bit differently than this, right? But we're going to use them. Okay, so now we're into the validate forms. You know that the form failed validation. Okay, now I want to check which elements failed, okay? So for each element that failed, I want to inject the new element, right? The new form, custom validation message, right? Again, going back to Stack Overflow for a second. Let's go back to that. Here. Notice that what it does is, the wrong one. Notice what it does is it goes through each of the form elements that failed validation, right? And what it does is it says, okay, let's set the validation to whatever it is, right? And then what it does, so this is the first step, and this is the for loop. This for loop, if you notice, it goes from here to here, right? So loops through, sets the custom validation messages, and then on input, this is on invalid, on input, right, which is another event, if you think about this. There's two events, on invalid and on input, right? So when the thing is fine again, it clears the validation problem, the error message. Okay. So one is on invalid and the other one is on input. And that's what this example does, right? Going back to here, we have input and invalid, right? These are the events that are part of the form, right? But we want to do it for each of the elements. I want to do it for each of the elements. That means there's a couple ways we can do this. One, I can set up event listeners for each of the elements, each of my elements, right? Just like I've done before. Instead of doing it that really nice, like the way they've got on a Stack Overflow is a really nice solution. Doesn't do custom error messages though, just one generic error message for each one, right? But we want to be able to do on input and on invalid. So the value of the selected state of the current element changes on input. Let's, swap out the message, right? And make it clear the message for that particular input. What do I mean by that? Okay, going back to our form. Let's go back to one more time. Yeah. Going back to our form, let's refresh the form for a second. So here's the input, right? And here's the input. And here's the input. It says, please fill out this field. That's what it says for each of them. Why? Because I got the required stuff in there, and it says enter your name, enter your contact number, enter your email address. These are the placeholder values, right? But this field itself needs two events. It needs an input, on input when I'm doing something, when I'm typing. I want to clear that field up, right? I want to clear the error message when I'm typing, right? Okay. And then blur, it says when the focus leaves the element. So when I click tab and go to the next field, what's going to happen is that I need to validate again, right? Because I'm moving from one field to the other field. Okay, as soon as I move from one field to the other field, hey, I want to validate. Is the field okay? Right? Because I've put some stuff in there, whatever it's going to be. So when I'm in there, in the field itself, I want to be able to clear my message. I don't want that annoying message coming up, right? So the set content validity or whatever, the custom validity is going to say nothing, no message, right? And then when I move, I want to check to see if it's valid again, right? Okay. Same thing with form input when the whole form itself, and if it's invalid. So there's a couple ways to do this. Do I check on blur or do I check on invalid? Invalid, when does that check? A control's value is found to invalid during constraint validation, which is what I'm doing here, right? Constraint validation. All right, let's see what that really means. So here's all of my elements, right? We did this on the local scope. I want to set all of these event handlers for each of the elements, right? I need to do this. Each of the element must have some kind of event handler that I'm going to be using, right? I need to check if it's valid or not. I need to check I need to clear it when it becomes valid, and I need to clear it when I'm typing, right? So that's what I need to know. So each of these elements. So I could, for each of these elements, right, go through and make a custom validation message, or I could set my events for each of the message, which is what I'm going to do in a loop, right? In fact, I'll put it inside of a, before I do my validate form, I'll have another little function that says function, we'll say set event handlers for form elements. I'm making it really long so you know what the hell it is, right? So you're not confused. Not because it's a great name. It's a massive name. Set event handlers for form elements. It's like huge, right? So now there's two ways I can do this. I can do it through this by each of the ones. Each separate one I can set the events. I know that I only care about the first four in my case, in my form. If I wanted to add other form elements though, right? Like let's say if I had, instead of full name, I wanted to do first name and last name later on. I want to change it. And if I hard coded it, then I'd have to go through and change this little algorithm I'm going to write, right? In here. It would be nice if we can only look at form elements that have, that are inputs, right? We don't care about form elements that are buttons, right? Only inputs. So I would want to try and detect those. And what about the form elements that are text areas? So text areas or inputs, I want to validate, right? Okay, so we're going to do that first. So I want to loop through, and I want to loop through each of the elements. I don't care about, the elements that are, I'm not going to do a for loop in this case. I want to do a for each. So I'm going to go for each. And the array that I'm looping through is the elements array that's in the form, right? So again, I'm going to go to document.forms, right? 0.elements is the elements array. So I'm looping for each of the elements, right, as an example. And when I set the event handlers for each of the elements, I want to put them in here. For each element, So element dot add event listener. Notice that element, unfortunately, isn't giving me any code hinting because I don't know what element it is. Right now, the element that we're looping through, right, it's not of type any, it's of type HTML element. That's what it is. However, my element isn't picking it up because we're using normal JS. By the way, in TypeScript, as an aside, it would totally pick this up. I would know the exact data type of my element, and so I would get better code hinting. TypeScript is amazing for this. Better than Babel, better than any other kind of transliteration or transpiling kind of thing, because what it does is it says, okay, what data type do I have? Can I detect the data type of my element? Right now, we don't know the data type because an array could have a million different kinds of data types, right? Array could be number, Boolean, whatever. We don't know. So when I look at element, it says any. That's what it does. Okay, what are the other four, the looping types? There's this one. There's for in and for of. How about the other ones? Do they give me any more? Let me just kind of comment this out for now, and I'll put this to do. We'll say to do in here. I'm doing this protracted example because you're going to run into this issue when you try and do something more advanced, right? So document. So I want to do a for in. So if I go for, there's a for in, right, and a for of. Remember a for in? It says for in loop JavaScript basics, a const key in object, and the key is the index. Do I want this one? Probably not, right? How about the for of? If I go for of, it says JavaScript language basic, an iterator of my object. For every iterator of the object, in this particular case, go through using the object iterator type. Okay, this might help us a little bit more. This one, for in, it's the key in the object, whatever the key is, which is an index. That's what the key is. Whereas the for of loop gives us an iterator of the object. Okay, let's see if I can do it in this way. So we'll just keep iterator. We'll call it iterator, but the object is going to be this, right? The elements object, right? That's what I want to iterate through. So if I say iterator dot, again, I get some other stuff, scroll and so on, but can I do an add event listener? And here I can, right? And it gives me coding for that, right? Which is what I want. So it won't do it here with element, because element is of type any, but iterator, right, is of type element. So here is a great example for where the for of loop works better than the for each loop for our elements. Does that make any sense? You guys are like going, what the hell is he talking about, right?
Did you assume this came from?
Kind of, but we can call this whatever we want. This iterator can be called element, right? And the element is the one we want to add event listener on, right? I want to say that the elements dot add event listener, right? And which event listeners do I want to add it for each of the elements, all right? For each of the elements that are inside of my form, I want to add an event listener, but I don't want to add them for elements that have it's a form element, and the type of element is what I really want to check, right? What type is it? Is it an input? What is it, a text area? What type is it? How do I detect that, right? But I want to add an event listener, so there's two. I want to add in if I'm typing, right? So like it says here in our Stack Overflow, actually it says it here too, input is what I want to check on input. So let's do that first. So every time I input something, so if I say add event listener, and I can say input, and by the way, all the event listeners are here for the different types of events, but I want to look at input types of events. Okay, for input, I want to create a function as an example for each of the elements, right? And each of these functions, what they're going to do on input is they're going to wipe away my custom validity method. I'm going to kind of do this, but instead of having these two big functions, I'm going to say whatever that element is, I want to element set custom validity, and I want to set it to nothing. All right, so only when on input, when I'm typing into the element itself. Okay, that makes sense. So I'm looping through each of the elements, and I'm setting this up. But I'm doing it even for my buttons, and the buttons I don't need to loop through the buttons, right? So how do I check to see what the element is, right? Well, I know that element itself has a lot of, stuff. Tag name, element.tag name, right? So tag name is, the tag name itself. Let's see if we can check on tag name. What other things can we do, right? So, can we check on type? No. Node type, we can. Let's print this out. So let's go as we loop through in this particular, the first iteration, let's just do a console log, right? And we'll say tag name. Oops, let's do the real way, the new way. Tag name, right? And then we'll inject in here the tag name, right? So element tag name, right? I want to print that out. I want to know what that tag name is. Can we check to see what the tag name is to make sure that we don't do the next set of stuff on for everything? I don't care about the buttons. I only care about my my two elements. So the input and text area elements. All right, let's see how that works, right? So again, I'm going to kind of send. It's going to give me my please fill out this field, right? We're going to get to this in a second. And then form length is 6. It says each of the form elements have nothing in them. And then when I start typing, right, it wipes it out, right? And what I want to see is, if I click send, I want to see my validation message. But one thing we forgot to do, we never called this set event handlers for form elements ever. And I want to do that in my validate form function. So set event handlers form elements, right? So we're calling validate form here, right? And validate form is calling this right now. Because validate form is going to have more than one function. It's going to have this, and it's going to call a bunch of other ones, okay? So this set event handlers for form elements is now being called. And if I go in and type nothing and click send, okay, it says please fill out the form. If I say Tom, notice it says tag name input in caps, right? And again, going back to our Stack Overflow example, you can see that's exactly what's happening, right? We're saying, the tag name is input in this case. So if it's input, right, or if it's text area, those are the two we care about. If it's not, if it's something else, right, let's see what the other ones are, right? So if I loop through, and instead of doing this custom validity, right, are you guys good? Okay. So that's what this does. This loops through every element, right? And as an example, and it prints out the tag name of each of the elements. Tag name being what I want to check. All right. So I don't care about anything that doesn't have those form elements that are either input or text area. But let's see what the text area looks like, because this is important. So again, I'm going to go back to our form, and I go here and type in some values. And how about here? Well, this one says text area, all caps again, all one word, text area. Okay. So input, text area. So those are the two that I care about. What about this one, right? This one is button, right? And it's actually saying, please include a @ symbol for my email address because this doesn't validate. So it's allowing me to pass through, right? Because my @ symbol doesn't have it. If I go Tom @, this is enough to validate my thing. Tom @ T. T @ T is enough. That doesn't make any sense, right? From a email address perspective, but it's enough for the HTML form, right, to go through. So if I go through to the next level, no problem. But now if I click send, it validates. It goes through, right? Because that was enough to validate my form. My form is now valid. And so when I click the send button, it ignores all that other stuff that I just did, right? Okay, so we know that the tag name we're looking for is text area, and we know it's input. So we can check. We can say, hey, I'm not going to loop through and set custom validity for all of them, or even event handlers. I don't even want to set event handlers for each of these things, for the elements. I only want to set event handlers, right? This is the input event handler. I don't want to set event handlers for everyone. I want to change the event handler so it's only if my tag name is text area or input. So I can do that. I can say if, right, element.tag name, right, is exactly equal to, right, input, right, or element.tag name is exactly equal to text area. Only those two cases will I be able to do this.
Okay, so more complex forms.
Something else. Maybe there's some other kind of elements that I have in there, like other things in my form that I put in there. I want to ignore the other stuff. I only want to do it for input or text areas. Does that make sense? And to show this, if I didn't do the text area one, let's just not do the text area one for a second. Okay, so only want it for inputs, but not text area for now. So let's get rid of this. Actually, what I'll do is I'll do one of these, and this, and this, right? Just so that you can that's what I really want, but I'm only doing input. And then let's do a console log when I do this. So console log, right? And again, I want to output the element itself that I'm into. So this element, right? So it's $element. Not the element value, but rather the element itself. Now, if I do this, there's a difference between doing this, by the way, element, and quotations element, or no quotations, just element, like this. So I can just do this, right? One is making it into a string. The other one is actually, I want to see the element, the object itself, whatever that element is, okay? All right, so let's do that. So, okay, here, and then click send. And it says, okay, so I've got, in here it says it's a text email. But look what happened. I didn't get anything for error enter message for this. So T at T, that's all I need. So T at T, email address. Oh, sorry. Here, put that. It's wrong. But if I did this and I click send, it's going to say, hey, there's something that's wrong here. It's not letting me go. It says, please fill out this text field, but it's not really detecting. These are the three fields it detects because it avoids the text area. Okay. If I go back and I put this back, so this, right? And let's just for sake, I use a lot of parens when I do my if statements like this. I kind of separate them into different parens, right? I like doing it this way more. I think it's a little bit more clear. I say, so this is one case, this is another case, either one or the other. Notice I'm checking the input first because that's the most common one. I don't want to check text area first because that means it would take longer, right? It's never going to be text area. Only one case is text area, but all the other ones are inputs. So from an algorithm perspective, I want to check input first. If it's not input, then check text area. And that's only going to happen one time in our form. Okay? So now let's see what happens. So I'm going to save that and go through. And if I just click send, you can see that it goes input, input, input text area now. So it gets that text area if I check both. So it's either one or the other ones, but not the buttons, which is not what I wanted. Okay, so I don't need this anymore. So that we know that that's working. So we're going through it and validating each of the inputs, right? And we're just clearing the validation message for the input on input. However, we also want to add an event listener, right, for each of the elements if the element is not valid, right? So add event listener. And instead of input, we're going to say invalid, right? So when the event is not valid, what do we want to do, right? And just to put this into perspective, I'm just going to make it look nice. There we go. So there's two events. So this is for the input when the user enters in stuff. When the user is inputting data, we don't want the validation message to pop up. That's what so we clear it, right? And when the user enters incorrect data, right? So it's not valid, right? Doesn't conform to our validation message, right? Then I want to put my custom validation message. So now for now, let's just use a generic one like we do on Stack Overflow. So I'm going to say element dot set custom validation message, custom validity. We'll say just for our test, some custom error message. That's what it's going to say. Each one of them is going to say that. Okay. Okay, cool. So that's what this is going to do. Okay. And again, if I click send, it's going to say some custom error message, right? Because it looped through each of these objects and said, hey, now. But if I start typing, it's not going to do that, right? If I go to here, and if I click send, it's going to go down to this one and say set custom error. So now we're getting closer to what we want to happen, right? If that makes any sense. Right? So this one failed. This one's okay. This one failed. I want to go to this one and click send. Now this one tells me it's the some custom error message that's not good. And you notice that it keeps printing this out for us over and over again because they're not right yet. And you can see that this one has element 1 and so on. And then I do my email address, T@T. That's good enough right now, right? And I click send. And now that's not good because there's nothing inside there. So it did all of them. So we've confirmed that that works. Okay, what about if I just enter the proper message? And if I click send, is that enough? And the answer is it's yes. So that's enough for us to clear the message, and it'll add the message in only when it needs to. Caution. Caution. Remember what I talked about at the beginning with these messages. First of all, I'm running an inline function that's inside of a function. There's 2 inline functions that are inside of this big function. These are considered callback functions, right? And I'm writing them anonymous and inline. That's what they are, anonymous inline functions, okay? Okay, anonymous inline functions. However, what's going on here? What we're actually doing is we're increasing the memory, you know, we're actually adding these functions onto the stack, right? And it's taking more memory. In a very long form, you know, and if we added a bunch of, you know, elements, all these event listeners in each of the form, it's more heavy in terms of memory usage. I'm just putting it out there. For most applications, we don't care. All right, that's reality. But remember that anytime we add an event listener, we should clean up the event listener as well, right? So what I want to do is at the end of all this, when I'm good with validation, and chances are I don't care because I'm leaving. When my form is going, it's wiped out and I'm going somewhere else anyway, right? I don't care about this. The only time I care about this is when I'm validating my form, right? So when I clear out, I never have to go here again. That's the answer. I'm never going to enable all this functionality. Yes.
So in terms of long and complex forms, like maybe while gathering the health-related data or insurance data, things will slow down?
It shouldn't, because I mean, it's just these there's almost like you're creating functions for each of these elements. Each element is going to have an event handler, right? I'm just putting it out there that if you had 1,000 entries on the form and it was one big form and one big page, you'd have 1,000 functions that have been added, right? So from a memory usage perspective, I just want to keep that in your mind. And here, I'm not just adding one, I'm adding 2, right? So for each form element, now I have 2 functions. So if I have 1,000 things I have to enter into a form, I'm going to have 2,000 functions, function objects that I'm going to have to keep track of right now, the way it is, all right? Never mind all these functions that I've created, right? All right, cool. So this is good, but set custom error message is wrong. That doesn't make any sense. I want to make my custom error messages up here. I've kept this here just so that I can use these custom error messages. I need to detect which one of them they are, right? So I'm going to go through each of the elements, but what other things can I get from the element? I know that I can get tag name, get element by tag name. What about ID? Because that I can totally check as well. So here I'm inside my set custom error message, and I want to say console.log, right? And I want to push out the IDs for each of these things. I'm going to say element.id. Can I do that? Yeah, I can. Element ID is also another way of doing it, right? Instead of input tag name on tag name, I have IDs I can go through. I have class. I have a bunch of other stuff I can get to. I have names. I have values. I have whatever I want, right? So if I go back and if I click send, it's going to say that full name, contact number, email address, and message. It goes through because these are all the IDs that have been added into. Each of these invalid functions have been added in, right? That's what element ID is. And this is my custom error message. Okay, cool. Well, now I know that depending on the ID, right, I can add a different message, right? And it's going to be if else, or even better than that, switch, right? Which means I can do a switch case, right, on element.id, right? And what I could do is, depending on the case, so if I say case, now the element, we have to be very careful. It has to be matched identically, right? So full name, now I know what they are because I made them, right? Break, and then case, contact number, break, and then case, what is it, email address, break, and then case, message, break. And from a default perspective, we're going to have a default case as well. Okay, so that's our little switch. And I don't have to do this anymore, but let me just grab these things in here. Instead of full name set custom validity, right? But I can do this, of course, if I really want to. I can say full name.set custom validity, but I don't have to do that. I can just say element, right? Because we know that the element is the one, this element, whatever it is, as I'm looping through, set custom validity to this, right? And I can do the other ones as well. So I'm going to grab the contact number. So again, I'm just going to put element in there just for being more precise, because you don't have to do the actual names. And we're going to get rid of, eventually you're going to see what we're going to do, but I have to step you through everything one step at a time. And one more. All right, there we go. All right, so there's the, and then we have a default one where we can say that let's just paste that back. We can say that the element set custom validity would be something like, this field or is required. Okay. So why did I do this? Because what if we had other fields in the future and I didn't say it's not a full name, contact number, email address, or message. It's going to still have some kind of field message. It's going to come up. Doesn't matter which one, right? All right, let's see if this works. Nice idea. We made the idea, but what about working? Okay, so send. It says you must enter an appropriate full name, at least 2 characters. That works now. I'm typing my character, so Tom. And then I click send. It says you must enter a phone number with a pattern, blah, 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 right? So here's my pattern. Because it's telling the user what to do, right? 416-555. By the way, it's not checking really. Right now, I'm just giving messages, right? And my email address, all right, if I click on send, I'm checking each one. Your email address is not valid. Okay, so maybe that's not the right thing. Maybe something like you must enter a proper email address or something like that. And if I say, now what if I just said T, right? And it says include a thing in this thing, right? So T is not enough. Like it kind of came up right away, right? Which is kind of weird. And if I go T at T, then that's okay, right? That's the one message that it wants. And if I click send, it says you must enter a message, right? That's good. So then I enter a message, and so far it's good enough. And then we're good. Validation. Are we good with what I'm doing? I'm trying to step through it very slowly with you so you understand the process, right? By the way, we still haven't validated a darn thing. All we're doing is sending messages out saying something's wrong. We know that something's wrong. We don't know what's wrong, right? Okay. Are we good on this part, though? Because this part, even though we have less time, is the part that really matters, right? So in my PowerPoints that I've put up, these are really important things. And again, we talked about different kinds of events. You can actually put other kinds of events in here. For example, every time I change, the focus leaves the element and it's changed, I can check if I really want to. Sometimes I need to do that depending on the type of element, right? Like for example, a checkbox or something that doesn't make sense. I mean, you can go really, really specific here. when the focus is on an element, I can give, kind of a message. I can give messages when I enter the box and when I leave the box, right? There's all kinds of custom validation that I can do here, okay? The rest of this, it talks about form elements, which we've already done. And it talks about different things like data lists and sliders and a bunch of different kinds of elements and how to do that for different elements. I'm going to skip this one for now. This is for your reading. What I do want to go to now is the on page 22 of week 9's presentation, I'm going to talk about regular expressions. All right. So we want to be able to look at the form and go, hey, something's wrong. And I want to have a pattern, right? One thing I can do to make it simple is in my form itself on the page, index.html, on my contact.html, on the page itself, you can see that I have each of the elements have different things. So for example, I can say that the minimum amount of without doing any regular expressions, for my full name is like 2 characters. And because it's an input type element, right? Input elements have a bunch of different properties or attributes. And if you want to look those up, so again, input attributes, HTML. And if you look at input attributes on HTML on W3 Schools, again, our nice little savior, you can see that there is a max length attribute that looks like this, max length, right? And there's some stuff that we can do in the actual without JavaScript. Remember we talked about the 3 pillars? Structure, presentation, and behavior. We can do a lot with structure with 0 JavaScript, right? Using this kind of stuff. So value, we talked about the value. Read only, if it's a form, if the element is read only or not. Some elements you want to make read only. For example, if you're reading something from a database and you want to output them to an input element, right? Sometimes we do that. We kind of, inject data into an element, but we don't want the user to change anything. We can mark it as read only, so you can't change anything, right? If it's disabled, the size in terms of number of characters that the input element will take. So I say, I only want 10 characters. This is really important for things like student ID, right? I don't want more than 10 characters because no student ID, as an example, in my school, in my mind, 10 characters. I don't know what that is, if it's true or not. Maybe it's 7 or 6, whatever. But if they try and enter more, it's going to stop them. It won't allow them to enter more than 10 characters or whatever the number is. Maximum length, allows us to limit the length. And there are others. So it also says HTML5 attributes for the input includes autocomplete, autofocus, the form that it's part of, it references the form action, the form type, form method, form no validate. All this stuff is for each of the input elements, right? So placeholder, required, step, all these things, and min and max. So min and max. So if you look through, here's all the stuff that's in here on W3 Schools, which is really, really cool. But I want to skip through to min and max. So height and width, how big it is for an image. Sometimes it's an image element. Here's min and max. So what you can do is you can say min is this, if it's a birth date, if it's a type of day, right? Min is 1, max is 5, right? So I want a number quantity between 1 and 5 for a quantity. So how many? And this is specify the minimum and maximum values. So whatever's in the value itself. So if I wanted a value between, 1 and 10, right? If it's 0, it's not going to be valid, right? And then it'll trigger my invalid, right? Which I can check to see what the values are. And I can say that for that particular form that's asking for a certain value, that's invalid, all right? Because it's not between the 2 values I want, okay? Example of this would be dates, right? How old are you? Right? Well, I am, I was born May 31st in 2018. Is that right? No, of course not. That means I'm like, how can I be answering the form? I'm obviously a baby, right? So that's not right. So I can put like a minimum value. You at least have to be 1 year old, right? Well, that doesn't make any sense. Maybe 2 years old. Well, that doesn't make any sense. How about 3 years old? I don't think so, right? Maybe 10 years old, right? So maybe like, you're going to go into a range. So you can't put in some wanky date, right? At least 10 years ago. You have to be at least 10 to enter the form. And that's really good for things like, I want to look at a video that's R-rated, Right? I want to be at least 18, right? So they check that minimum, maximum values. And you can do that all within the form. Multiple. And sometimes we use multiple for things like if I have an option, a bunch of options, and I can control click different options in a list, right? Then multiple would be used. But this is the one I care about right now, the pattern attribute. And what the pattern attribute does is it allows us to enter a pattern of special characters in here, right, that I want to use that I can validate. Okay. Now I can add it in here in the HTML side, or I can add it in JavaScript. And of course, we're JavaScript. So we're going to add it in the JavaScript side, right? And what the pattern will do is it will fail, right, if the pattern is incorrect. So again, it says it works with the following input types: text, search, URL, tell, email, and password. Pattern will not work for text area, right? It's not part of the input. I'm not going to go through a text area and look at patterns in a text area. So we're not going to validate text. All we care about is the text area exists. So our text area is done. We don't have to ever do anything with text area. But email, phone number, and maybe even our full name, we need at least 2 characters. We want some kind of pattern to be put there. And we can do that. And there's 2 places, one inside of the HTML document, and the other one is the pattern inside of our document. Here, if you notice, there's a link for regular expressions up on line 2. And this is some really great stuff about regular expressions. And what it does, regular expressions, by the way, are not just for JavaScript. So the stuff I'm going to be talking about here work for any language. It's a standard for C#, C++, Java, any language. You'll hit regular expressions again. Yeah.
It's similar to like right?
Yep. Yeah. It's all the same. So, for example, if you say there's different things, and if the way it works is the PowerPoint is actually not bad in terms of explaining in this particular case. So what it does is you have these 2 slashes. Okay. So again, must begin with and end with forward slashes. That's our regular expressions. That's the first requirement. So begin and end with regular this thing. You can also use the regular expression constructor. So I can make a new regx xp, right? Regular expression. A new reg expression creates a new object if I want to use that. Okay. But you don't really need to in our case. So here's some examples. So here's our URL protocol. I want to check to see that my URL. If so give me your address, okay, your URL for your website. I can ask that for a user if you have your own website or something. And I can check to see if my URL protocol is HTTPS, right? Which is the secure protocol for HTTP, which, by the way, is going to be the standard. Google said straight up, it's not going to start it's going to stop referencing HTTP. It's only going to reference HTTPS because HTTP is insecure, right? Not secure. All right, so here's our URL. You can see HTTP, and it's looking for HTTPS. And what I can do is with this result, I can say that if the regular expression dot search, if I use the search method of the regular expression, and if this is the URL for my new search, this is the new search pattern that I'm making, and if I'm searching my object, right, my string, the search, whatever I put in the search method of the string, because this is part of all strings, search, right? If it doesn't match the string itself, it's going to return a -1. Okay? So that's what it does. So this is the, going back to, if you look at this PowerPoint presentation, actually, it shows you that there are a couple things you can find, search and replace for strings, right? And again, we're going to kind of deal with this again. I don't want you to focus on this part because this is all about advanced string manipulation and so on. We're going to hit this later on. So notice that there's match and search, and there's also going to be a replace. But notice the pattern here. It says that is a case-sensitive search and returns the position number in a string of the first instance of the first character in the pattern, right? Okay, and that returns a -1 if it's searched. Now, we don't care about that. All we care about is the pattern. But I wanted to show you that it also applies to strings. You can use regular expressions to search whole strings to make sure that they're correct, like this one. Okay, let's keep going. There's also the test message to see if it passes or fails. And here's an example of a pattern. So here's an email pattern that they've provided for you, right? So it says, must start with an M with this. It looks like gobbledygook, right? When you look at this, you're like, what the heck? What does this mean? It's not complex. Here's what it means. So
just one example, no, actual example. See, like, for example, there are 5 places in the string, so place by place, alternate lines.
well, again, I'm not going to go through a protracted example today because regular expressions aren't for today. Regular expressions are going to be for week 9, right? So I'm going to cover week 9. We're going to spend a lot of time doing that. This
Maybe just simple example.
I'm actually not going to do that either. I'm going to do an example that matches with what our it's because here we're form validation is 1205, and I want to make sure that we hit our form validation, right? So what I want to do is I want to add a pattern, right? And the pattern itself is the thing that I want to match. Okay, so I want to use a pattern for my regular expression. Okay, so notice that here's my regular expression patterns, right, as an example, right? And in my regular expression, the way it works is star matches any single character, backslash identifies the next character as literal values, whatever that literal value is. The caret, this up thing here, it says matches characters at the beginning of a string, right? The $ matches characters at the end of a string, right? So you can match one or the other. Open bracket and close bracket or parens specifies required characters to include in a pattern match. So I need these things as an example. Square brackets specifies alternate characters allowed in a pattern match. So A to Z, A-Z, lowercase, that would be a pattern, right? And then curly brackets with a caret, right? Square brackets with a caret specifies characters to exclude in a pattern match. So I don't want to include these ones. And then the dash identifies a possible range of characters, and the pipe character, which is up like this, specifies alternate sets of characters to include. So it's like an or, either this one or this one, right? So going back to our pattern here, it starts at the beginning, right? Because this is the caret. The square brackets tell us a range of characters from, it says underscore A to Z, and then A to Z. Underscore is actually a range, this part of the range. So underscore could be underscore, the email, right? And then 0 to 9, it could be. And then a literal value of dash, right? It could be that. And then plus, right? In addition to that, that's what it means. I also want, this is required. This is what's required in here. I want some kind of dot, right? With square brackets like this, square brackets that go from A to Z, lowercase, or A to Z, uppercase, or 0 to 9, right? And then some kind of anything that matches those, right? An @ symbol has to include an @ symbol, right? And then a range of other characters, then plus a dot, and then some other characters at the end. That's what this is basically saying. So I know it looks like gobbledygook, but actually it's just a pattern, and that's why it's a regular expression. You're looking through a pattern to see if it matches. And what you're going to say is, hey, if my pattern is this, great, you're valid. If my pattern is this, you're not valid anymore. Okay, so let's try this out. Now, there's a couple of really cool patterns I'm going to tell you about. One of them is this regular expression for telephones. And I'm going to kind of copy this. I found this on the web. I'm going to copy this and put this on your Slack. So you can have this as, this is a regex for phone. So regex for phone. Okay, that's one of them. It tells you the regular expressions for most phone numbers. It'll work. And there was this is the answer right here. So here it looks like it starts at the beginning and starts at the end, and it creates these kind of telephone patterns. It'll match these telephone patterns, right? And I also have an email address regular expression that matches 99% of emails, because emails are changing, and this is it. It's pretty massive. But in JavaScript, all you need is this. All right, so this is the one. So I'm going to grab this one, emailregex.com, and I'll put that in there. So email regex, I'll say regex for email. And there's a bunch of other ones out there too, but I wanted to share these two with you so that you have those two regular expression patterns for future use. And you can find a lot of other ones on the web if they don't work. Okay, how do we use these? So that's one. Notice it says, here's input type, and then it says placeholder is this for HTML5. And then this is what they use for type email from the W3C, right? That's the email pattern for there. And let's use the one for JavaScript. So I want to grab this whole JavaScript pattern. Okay, so I'm going to copy it for email. And now if I take this, just putting it out there, right? And if I put it in my code, how do I put it in there? Like, do I put it in? Let's try first in the pattern, from a pattern perspective, okay? So if I say something like email, right? And I can say pattern is equal to, and then just drop it in, right? Does that validate on HTML? No. But this one does. And I can tell it doesn't validate because we have these weird colors on the symbols, right? So this beginning and ending is all you need, right? Theoretically. So that doesn't look like it's going to work, right? Because I'm getting this funky stuff going on where even if I put the ending and the beginning for the email, this is what it would normally look like. I'm just putting it out there, right? So that way you can see what I'm talking about here. So if I save this one and I go back to my form, I got this, right? Hey, I'm putting it out there, guys, because you're going to try this out and it's going to fail, right? Okay, cool, cool. I like this, right? But I want to kind of establish a pattern for email anyway. So how do I do that? So okay. And by the way, if I go back to my regular expression pattern for email here, you can see that my email pattern is this, and there's no quotation marks here at all, right? There's no quotation marks, right? So that's on the JavaScript side. But what about for the email side, for HTML? So HTML, a pattern, input pattern, email, right? So if I did that, and I want to do this one, if it takes me right down to my pattern attributes for in W3 Schools, right? And notice it says, here's a pattern attribute, dot, curly braces, 6, right? It says element with type is equal to password that must contain 6 or more, 6, comma. So this is the range of characters, 6 or more characters, right? That's the pattern, okay? Here's one, pattern from this to this, and notice that I've got it working. This is the same thing that I've got. So what's wrong with my pattern? Because this one is like, it says a password with at least 8 characters, right? And here is email password. Pick a time. I hate when this happens. Sorry, guys. Wow, this is really inconvenient. I don't know, 8 p.m. tonight? How about that? 8:12. Sure, 8:12 p.m. Great. Isn't it? Don't you love that? And by the way, I've done that before in the middle of a class, and I'm done. Right? I'll just take over and I'm updating. Right? Yeah. So this pattern here. If I have a square bracket for my email pattern, and I'm going to go all the way to here. Notice that this is inside of quotations. So I'm taking this little email pattern. I'm just going to put this out to you, and I'm going to go back to. So this is kind of like this, but notice that there's no bracket here. There's no caret. Here I don't have a caret, and I do have this dollar sign, but I don't have this kind of form field right here, right? And I'm going to go back to my form here and replace it. So I'm going to say pattern equals to, and then go down here, way over here. Whoa, without it jumping too much, and replace it. And that kind of looked like it worked, like this limit. So let's try this email pattern and see if it works. This email pattern here, right? So we'll do one pattern at a time. So again, I'm doing it in HTML and see if it validates. So what does this look like? If I go back to here to the file, so I'm going to type in my name and my contact number. That's okay now. And if I type in email pattern, and if I go so send, it's going to say, well, your email address is not valid. And if I go tom@tom, and then it says, please match the requested format. That's new, which I didn't state, right? And say, by the way, you need this, right? But if I go Tom, and if I click send, it's going to say, no, it's wrong. Something's not right. What's my format? It's going to be tom@example.com. Well, that's valid, right? I'm going to just example dot. Is that good? Yeah, that's good. That's weird, right? But example.com will be okay. So it will give you validation in the browser like this. And if I click send now, it's just going to give me that message that there must be something there. So that kind of validates us from that perspective. All right, what about the phone number thing? By the way, I'm just using that one just by chance. You can use other ones. So the phone number thing is this one, right? And it says, okay, so again, I want to use this one. And notice I have my carrots. And let's see if this is going to work. Remember, it didn't work last time because this is for JavaScript. It's not for HTML, right? So let's go back to my HTML pattern. And here's my contact number. And again, after my ID, but before my name, it doesn't matter where you put it. But let's say I want to add in this pattern. There it is, right? So there's my pattern. Cool. And let's check and see if that works. So going back to my thing. That's why Riaz, I don't have any time to go through it because there's no time. Not because I don't like it. I don't like your idea. So if I go back to my site as an example, and I say Tom, and my contact number is 416, and if I go back and if I click send, something's wrong, right? And look, it actually gives me this phone number pattern out, right? So if I say 416 dot, right? 555 dot 5555. Oh, that's pretty good. I can use dots or dashes, or I can also use, in this particular pattern that I chose, I can also use this pattern. Oops. And it would totally match dots or dashes because some people in some places use dots, some people use dashes, depending on where you're at. All right? And that's okay. And if I go to the tab, it should work now, right? So I got my email address, tom@example.com. And whatever this is going to be, and I click send, and we're good. That's it for validation that I'm going to show you. There's a ton more we can do, but they would take me another week. I'm not joking. Like you can see that we just scratched the surface here. Why is it like this? Because there's so much you can do. It depends. I mean, we only went through one type of form, a contact form. I could do email validation on an input form, a registration form, a sign-up form, a form that requires you to calculate stuff, like money forms. Different kinds of forms for validation, and there's different cases that you need to use for those. Not the ones I'm using. All right, so, and that's why I'm not going to deep dive into regular expressions because there could be different regular expressions. And notice I put them all on the HTML side, not on the JavaScript side. I could also include those on the JavaScript side, which I haven't done. And if I was to go through the JavaScript example, I'm running out of time. What you can do is you would check your validity, right, and make sure that the pattern is matched before the validity is true or not. You can have a pattern that comes up. We haven't done that, and that's the one part we missed. So here's something. I don't need to do this anymore, right? But clear validation message is pretty cool. I want to clear that anyway. But this function here, this set custom validation messages, unnecessary. Let's get rid of this, clean this up. That was part of our development. Yeah. Yep. That's our new thing from Visual Studio Code. And also notice that I use these, but I could avoid using them now, right? So I may not want to put them here, right? All right. For the lab for today, again, all I want you to do is go through the exercise we did today, put it up online, kind of show me, go through it, and do your custom validation messages. Please use your own custom validation messages so I know it's your lab, not my lab. That's the one thing that I want to make it different, right? If you just copy and paste my code, it's not really doing what I'm asking you to do, right? You should really try to understand what I've done here as much as possible, right? Notice that I took away the prevent default. That prevent default is gone now, right? It's here. Look, I've commented it out, and I don't need to do this anymore because I'm using this check validity, right?
So there.
This is for the cancel button. But for this button here, I haven't prevented default anymore because if I prevent default, my friends, then the validity controls for the form go out the window, right? We talked about that today, all right? So please do your exercise, do by midnight tonight. That's a soft date for it again. What I'm looking for is just to fix up your form so it validates. You don't need all this extra stuff. But for your assignment 2, just before we leave, I want to mention a couple things. Please make your output to the console look like something, you know? I mean, some people do their output to the console and there's nothing. There's literally just like the output, my values. Please add something like this. Use some templates like this. And this is a good practice for templates because on the test, I may ask you for something like that next week, right? On next week, before we leave, we have no more minutes left. We're done. But on next week, I want to mention 2 things. Tuesday next week is very important because I'm going to do a review in class, right? And I'm reviewing the stuff that are going to be on the test for Wednesday. All right. So next week is important. There's only 2 weeks I really need you to be in, okay, in class. So for people who are watching remotely, I'm not gonna publicize. I will not broadcast my review on Tuesday. I want you to physically be here in class. There's only 2 times I want you to that. Actually, there's 3. 1, the first day of class would be good, right? So this one is a really important day. The next week is an important week because you're doing your test. So I'm not gonna broadcast anything next week. No broadcast, all right? And the final week of class, also I will not broadcast because there will be like a review and a test, right? So please come in for a review. I will not broadcast it. I will go over stuff and I'll answer your questions. So that way, Tuesday is the day for questions for everybody. If you don't come in on Tuesday, you're not going to get any questions answered. I need you to come in physically, okay? Any questions around that? All right, guys, thank you so much. Please do your exercise. Remember that on Friday, your assignment 2 is due. I will not allow you to hand it in late without a penalty this time around. So that means if you're late on assignment 2, and I've just given you the way to do assignment 2, right? So it's ridiculous if you're late. Then you'll get a 20% penalty each day. All right. Thank you so much, and see you next week. I'll put this up on GitHub.